So good afternoon. My name's Chris Deerin. I'm the Director of Reform Scotland, and welcome to today's event, which is our third of this week. On Monday, we had the great American crime novelist Don Winslow, who's retiring from writing to fight against the return of Donald Trump in 2024. And yesterday, we had a fascinating debate on the future of Scottish education with some of the country's leading experts. But in the spirit of saving the best till last, today we have, well, I hope so. Today we have with us one of the UK's most renowned and celebrated journalists. I think introducing Andrew Marr feels a bit like introducing the Queen or perhaps Terry Wogan or something, in that he's a national treasure and there's very little we don't already know about him. He's been an ever-present in our lives for decades now, on our TV screens, in our newspapers, in our ear holes. And I think that polished Scottish brogue is probably as familiar to us as the voices of our friends and family. But introduce him I will, just as a quick refresher. Andrew began as a journalist at the Scotsman in, I believe, 1981.
That's right.
He was soon off to Westminster, where he was a member of the Independent's launch staff in 1986. And went on to be political editor of The Economist and The Independent before becoming that paper's editor in 1996, where he showed a flair and innovation with the front page that was controversial at the time, but that looking back now, I think ultimately changed the game for everyone else. What you were doing then is not uncommon now, even if you took pelters for it at the time. Andrew became political editor of the BBC in 2000, of course, where he covered the middle years of New Labour and all that went on then, the Iraq War, etc. And then, of course, took over the BBC's prime Sunday morning discussion programme, which ran for, I think, about 15 years. But recently, he decided, after 2 decades at the BBC, that it was time to get my own voice back. And as a result, he is now political editor of the New Statesman and a presenter on the LBC. And as if all this wasn't enough, Andrew has written a variety of books about British history, books about painting and drawing, and a couple of well-received novels. He is the definition of a Renaissance man, or, to look at it another way, quite irritatingly polymathic. I think, like many Scottish hacks of my generation, Andrew has been one of my great inspirations. 2 books in particular have been important to me. The first was The Battle for Scotland, which was a key text when I was training to be a journalist, and it genuinely helped to inform and shape my understanding of the history of our politics. And then secondly, My Trade, which is his journalistic autobiography, which is an essential and a highly entertaining read for anyone who wants to understand this thing of ours. I think his elegance of expression and his wit and his independence of mind have also been things that I, like many other hacks, have long aspired to. And personally speaking, it's great to have him back writing opinion pieces.
Chris, I'm too embarrassed. I'm just going to go away now.
I haven't asked the questions yet. Hold on. It's downhill from here. But anyway, it's a real pleasure to have him with us today. So welcome to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed. The only thing I'd really quibble with there, Chris, is that the novels were well received. They were not. They were disastrously received. Wow. My wife said the problem was that I had much more fun writing them than anyone ever had reading them.
Well, I did notice on the front that they'd obviously picked out the one good word then that each reviewer had used. Wonderful.
Pasted them together, yes.
Yeah, which is a good old trick. Just to let everyone know, we'll have a chat and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So please do, using the chat function on Zoom, send your questions to me, and we'll hopefully get the best of them to Andrew. As I always say, it's much more interesting if you guys engage with us rather than us just talking at you for an hour. But first, Andrew, I feel I should start with the question I know that everyone here wants me to ask, which is namely, what was it like sitting through the musical sections of your Sunday morning programme? I wonder if it was as excruciating for you as us watching, say, Ed Miliband and William Hague jogging their knees and nodding their heads vaguely in time as, I don't know, a hungover Kasabian attempted to up their energy levels at 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning.
Oh, yes. It could be absolutely excruciating. There were really embarrassing moments. And it added an air of kind of third-rate surrealism, which we all felt political programmes needed on a Sunday morning. Weirdly, I've just been out the house and bumped into Chrissie Hynde, who was one of the few singers on the programme, who was absolutely golden. But Charlene Spiteri, we had lots of great people.
Yeah.
But it was a very strange place to put them. I agree with that. Yeah.
It could be. Well, I want to ask about this decision to get your own voice back, as you've put it. And it's not like we hadn't been hearing from you on a regular basis, but you meant something very specific by that phrase, didn't you?
Yes. What I would say is I completely get it. I understand why the BBC feels that every sort of journalist, every presenter has to be entirely neutral as entirely neutral as it's possible to be. And that goes down to the way the BBC's funded the license fee. And I never went into any of my shows without reminding myself before I got into the chair that the show was being paid for by people who thought Nigel Farage was the bee's knees, were enthusiastic about Brexit and UKIP, people who are pro-Corbyn, people who are passionate, lifelong Scottish nationalists, and so on, and so on, and so on. And they all deserved at least the affectation of neutrality from the person in the chair. I mean, I always tried to be neutral. And journalistically, it's really useful, and it stuck with me. It's very important, particularly in reporting politics, to do your absolute utmost to get into the mind of people that you personally disagree with or on the other side. Because only once you really try to understand what, for instance, in the current context, so many North of England voters are doing when they're sticking with Boris Johnson despite everything, only when you understand that you begin to put together a proper picture of the whole situation. So I get all of that, but it becomes a habit, a self-censoring. I mean, having a view on something and then almost immediately swallowing it back down again and trying not to express it. And I find I was self-censoring in the pub. I was self-censoring sometimes in conversations with my family, and I felt I was becoming aged and grayer and very, very fast, becoming the sort of person I never wanted to be when I came into journalism. I came in, like most of us do, to ruffle feathers and cause a bit of trouble and have some fun. And the feathers had long disappeared, and the fun was vanishing too. And I just felt it was time to get back out there and go back to old-fashioned, as it were, shoe leather reporting with a notebook in my back pocket and saying what I felt before it was too late.
And we had Laura Kuenssberg on not so long ago, and she, I guess, like you, had an experience with the BBC that as social media came to dominate much of the discussion, the sort of level of abuse, but also the accusations of bias on both sides. I mean, you couldn't win really. Were just something that you either had to learn to live with, or you had to think about how you worked your way through that, or whatever. Did you have the view that basically if you were getting shouted at by all sides, you were doing something right?
Yes, and that's a dangerous view, of course, because all sides might be right as well. But yes, I was very accustomed to doing, this identical interview, and you get people saying that just shows Andrew Marr, typical Tory shill, Boris Johnson lover, neo-fascist, etc. And other people saying, Andrew Marr, yet again, you've let your left-wing Marxist instincts become a little bit too obvious. I'm never going to watch the BBC again. And it'd be the same remarks in the same show. Just shows that people see everything through their own spectacles. I should say in the normal three-dimensional life, I find people almost always courteous, interested. They might disagree with this or that, but they'd always want to engage and overwhelmingly friendly. But online, an entirely different world. Laura was amazing. She had it much, much worse than me because she's a woman and because she came in later. And I once said to her, how do you possibly find you can cope with this? And she just looked at me in a very Laura Kuenssberg, said, "Thing is, Andrew," she said, "I'm a boiled frog." When I got into the water, it was hot, and it got hotter and hotter and hotter, and I just coped with it. But nobody in their right minds would want to jump in now, which is a very good way of putting it, I thought.
No, indeed, she had an extraordinary period as political editor, and as you say, you've returned to the Scribbler's art, and you're now writing about politics again for a living. Has it been easy to cast off those BBC goggles and say precisely what you think? I mean, was there any rustiness, or is it like riding a bike?
Do you know, Chris, it's happened far faster than I expected, and I was ready for it. And I am at my happiest, writing against deadline on a story, a subject I feel strongly about and I know a bit about. I really enjoy it. I think it is the best fun that you can have with your clothes on, whatever. Fantastic.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't feel that you've been away. Taken to it again very quickly. And maybe let's talk about the big story of today, which is, of course, the local elections throughout Britain. And I'm sure we're all interested in your take on things. So it seems like Labour have routed the Tories in London, at least in councils that have long been Conservative safeholds, but perhaps they haven't done quite so well in other parts of the country, some of the red wall that they need to win back. I should say we're still waiting for the Scottish results, which are an STV system, to find out what's happened. But it does look like Labour have done a bit better. Perhaps there's the beginnings of a comeback there. But the SNP are still miles ahead. The Conservatives seem to have, you know, they're dropping 10 to 20 percentage points in some of the wards that I've seen. So they're suffering as a result of perhaps Boris's approach to politics, and also maybe Douglas Ross's U-turn on whether he should go or not. But I think, sticking to south of the border at the moment, what's your overall reading of what's happening down there?
Well, I find these really interesting because, you know, anyone watching this will be familiar with the notion, which I certainly share, that, you know, whether or not there's independence or devolution or whatever, the Scottish political culture is now completely different from the English political culture. There's been a division, different personalities, different newspapers, different broadcast programs, different issues. Almost nobody down south of the border talks about ferries, for instance, you know. So we've got a very, very different Scottish and English political culture. So you've got a kind of, if nothing else. And can you hear me all right?
Yeah, the sound changed a little bit there.
Are you hearing me all right?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Great. Something strange has happened to my.
Oh, that's it.
Anyway, I'll carry on. So there's that, and of course, Northern Ireland's always had its very different political culture. But I think what's happening, and these elections really undermine it, is that there is not any longer a single English political culture, or an English culture in which any party can claim hegemony across England. You're seeing a big division, which first opened up very dramatically in the Brexit vote, then the 2019 election, between the pro-Brexit Midlands and north of England, and the big sort of better educated cities, Oxford and Cambridge and London and so on. And that's been underlined. So we've got it's an election of two different narratives, whereby in the anti-Brexit cities and conurbations like London in particular, the Tories are being absolutely routed, but Labour is not able to climb back into those parts of the so-called red wall very effectively, where Boris Johnson is still convincing people that he's their prime minister, he's their Brexit prime minister, and he speaks for them. For all his foibles and misdemeanors and deceits and so forth, he is still their guy. And so there's that. And if you look to the southwest of England, if you look to rural England, where again things like Partygate matter much more than they do in the north, you're seeing the Liberal Democrats and, interestingly, the Greens coming forward much more strongly. So the Conservatives are no longer the English, as it were, national voice, as people would say for a long time. The SNP were in Scotland. That has fractured, that has broken, and we're now into what I would call a kind of patchwork politics right across the UK. It's the sort of politics of the kind of post-Roman Britain, where there are lots of different kind of kingdoms and fiefdoms all over the place. There's the Mercians and the Anglians and all the rest of it.
And it's very hard for any political leader to be both the leader of the cities and, I guess, the suburban and the rural areas, because they want quite explicitly different things. I always, sorry. Go on.
I always felt that, in a way, just as Tony Blair was able to win big election victories by reaching out from beyond Labour's normal heartlands into sort of Tory England on issues like law and order and crime and so on, and winning huge election victories, but at the cost of breaking the Labour Party's sense of who it was. You reach too far into your opponent's territory and you forget who you are. So Boris Johnson has done the same thing in reverse. He's reached deep into Labour territory, and he's got lots of MPs who sound like Labour MPs, and higher public spending and all the rest of it. But sorry, I've got all sorts of problems here on my computer. I hope it's working all right with your end. Sorry, yes, he's reached into Labour England very, very successfully, obviously in the Brexit vote and then in the 2019 election. But the cost is that the Conservatives no longer know really who they are. Are they still the, as it were, Thatcherite, cut public spending, fiscally austere Tories? Where do they stand on the sort of public behaviour, moral issues? Are they now morphing into a high public spending populist party? Who are they? They don't know. And to that is, as I say, patchwork.
And of course, just to stick with Labour for the moment, it's harder for Labour to win. They've won less than the Conservatives through history. And indeed, it was Blair that was, by far the most successful electoral leader that they've had. And to do that, he had to do the things that you say. And they've obviously had the Corbyn experiment today. We're hearing the wonderful, if slightly odd phrase, long Corbyn used today to explain why they've not done so well in the perhaps the red wall areas. But Keir Starmer, he's no Tony Blair, but then who is other than Tony Blair in a sense? But he is solid and decent and principled. I suppose the question then is he a winner? Is he a killer in that he will go for the jugular in the way that Blair did in the run-up to 97? I'm leading my party, you're following yours. Can he do that with any authority? Is it enough to be such an obvious contrast to Boris Johnson that people want a reaction against what he represents, and Starmer will be enough?
So, Chris, I feel very torn about this. I feel genuinely very sympathetic to Keir Starmer. I know him, and he is a thoroughly, impeccably decent, punctilious, law-abiding, despite what's going to happen after Durham, apart from beers here and there. Basically, a thoroughly decent, public service-minded guy of the kind we need more of in public life everywhere. But he's not charismatic. He doesn't have the sort of verbal fluency and the wit and the sort of unexpectedness that Johnson can deploy. Whatever you think of Johnson, you see Johnson in front of a crowd, including a hostile crowd, and he can be absolutely remarkable at disarming people, making them laugh, winning them over, etc., etc., etc. Now, you might say these are, as it were, the lower political virtues, if they're virtues at all. But in a raucous, kind of disputatious public arena, they really matter. And Keir Starmer hasn't got them, and candidly, he never will. You don't acquire those things in midlife. If it's not there, it's not there. So Labour are going to have to try to win without charisma against a charismatic leader, and that's never very easy.
No.
I would be more critical of Labour, really, in failing at this stage, I think, to have created a strong, clear narrative about why people should support them. Here we've had an utterly unsuccessful spring statement by Rishi Sunak, completely failing to answer the need of so many people in the country who are just simply not going to be able to pay their food or heating bills in the months ahead, never mind when winter starts to come round. And it's quite something that, despite all of that, the Tory vote has not collapsed. Now, why hasn't it collapsed? I think in large part because Labour is the main opposition party. We're not able to say, look, here is our big, bold, properly funded, comprehensible alternative package. This is what we are going to do for people who can't. They didn't really have anything like that. And I think that was a massive political failure.
It felt a bit in a slightly different way, like the New Labour era, where Blair versus Brown was such a good story and kept giving so much that there was no room for the Conservatives. It wasn't the Conservatives versus Labour, it was Blair versus Brown. And in a sense, at the moment, it's Boris Johnson against his own party or against Partygate or whatever, and it's hard for Labour to get through. But you're right that we're not sure what they're for. I'm not sure I could identify in particular any Labour policies. I know what they're against. I know that they're against Johnson and his character, and that they will stand up against the Rishi Sunak spring statement, etc. But I don't know what it is they're offering, and it might not be all that long till the general election. They're sort of relying a bit on the unpopularity of Johnson, time for a change, whatever. But they need to give people something to vote for. So I suppose figuring out, the fact that he's re-embraced aspects of New Labour and stop trashing the brand, I think is a good thing. He's obviously pushing the Corbynite left out as much as he can, but it's not going to be enough, is it, unless he can give people something in the transactional area of politics that they can choose to vote for.
It's enough in some areas. I mean, in Barnet, North London, which is really the epicentre of the London Jewish community, Labour have swept back in again. Getting rid of Corbyn simply allowed them to win Barnet, period. But certainly up in the north, I mean, it's very interesting. Starmer has been quite clever in starting to adopt, as it were, the old sort of, I don't know, Ernie Bevan, Dennis Healey, Jim Callaghan, working class patriotism, which Labour had lost totally, of course, under Jeremy Corbyn. So there are signs there, but I think the voters up in the north and the Midlands are still completely unconvinced by that. And on the other side of the fence, as it were, I keep thinking, because I'm an old git, and I came into political reporting during the high days and then the low days of Margaret Thatcher. Where is Michael Heseltine? Who is the Michael Heseltine of our time? Because when Thatcher was under real pressure, he was always like some kind of slightly mangy lion prowling around, snarling in the rhododendrons, always dangerous, always intervening at the appropriate times. And although Jeremy Hunt is the obvious Tory to take on Johnson in due course again, he's not like that. There is no big figure, as it were, semi-publicly inside the Conservative family going for Johnson. And that's what makes it a little bit harder to see a defenestration coming soon.
Well, Johnson, I suppose, very deliberately in 2019 booted a lot of those potential stalking horses or stalking lions or whatever out of the party, and so there is a huge tranche of moderate, quite principled Conservatives, One Nation Conservatives, who are just not in politics anymore. David Gauck, who's a colleague of ours at the New Statesman now, I think he's a must-read because he gives you that insight into what another type of Conservative party might look like. But you don't hear it in Westminster. In fact, you hear the populism and the opportunism of Johnson really versus, I guess, the sort of right-wing, this is not enoughness of Steve Baker, nothing is ever enough. Yeah. And that seems to be the push and pull.
I mean, there are plenty of folk around. Tugan Hat would be a good example. Yeah. Tobias Elwood, and there are others as well. Very interesting. A lot of people with a military background. Mm-hmm. No longer in politics. Rory Stewart. There are voices of the Conservative exile, the exiled Conservative Party, the kind of Prince over the water Conservative Party, which is still there somewhere. But as you say, without a really clear leader. And one of the things that I think, one of the people with the biggest problems ahead now is indeed Jeremy Hunt, because they would rally around him. He's getting support from the right of the party at the moment as well. But he's a very, very cautious guy. And he has to decide, does he go for it? Does he break into the open and go for Johnson and see what happens? Very, very dangerous. But I would say to him, you haven't got much left to lose.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things, it's 25 years since 1997, since that New Labour moment, which certainly for people of my age was, a big moment. And it was, I lived under a Conservative government as long as I was politically aware, and that sense of hope that accompanied that period was quite something. And we had Peter Mandelson on recently, and what really struck me then was how it felt a bit like a grown-up entering the room when I was talking to him, both in terms of his experience and everything that he's done and achieved, both good and bad perhaps, but also I think the quality or the depth of the thought that he had applied to policy and was applying to policy. And it really struck me that it had been a long time since I'd heard a front bench politician, really of any type perhaps, but certainly on the governing side of things, being able to talk with that authority, or the sense that there was a hinterland and there was a lot, that was the iceberg where what you saw on the surface was just hiding really the depth that was underneath. Thinking back to that period, and you were BBC political editor 2000, 2005, do you see the difference in the kind of people we're getting in politics?
No, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
New Labour had the luck of just a cadre of very, very, very talented politicians, one after another. Interestingly, I had Neil Kinnock on my show recently, and I was reminded by what a fantastic speaker he was in his prime, in his pomp. But during that period, an awful lot of Scots. One thing we haven't talked about is the sudden vanishing of the Scottish Labour Party and all the rest of it. But when I came in, there was, John Smith had recently gone. He, by the way, he would have been my prime minister. I was a John Smith man, really. But he'd gone. But we had Robin Cook there. We had Dewar. We had Alistair Darling. We had a whole stream of very, very powerful, and Gordon, of course, as well. Very powerful, potent people who had been brought up in the atmosphere of the Scottish Labour Party. Very, very literate people. They'd read a lot of books. They knew an awful lot about politics, and they all spoke extremely well.
And actually, even on the Conservative side and through the Thatcher years, there were always Scots in significant positions, whether it was George Younger or Malcolm Rifkind or Michael Forsyth latterly or whatever. So that sense, if you were up here, Westminster, there was plenty of opposition, obviously. People wanted a Labour government, the majority of Scots, and were getting Conservative governments. But nevertheless, you would turn on your radio and you would hear those accents on the Today programme, and you didn't necessarily feel that Scots had just been removed from the conversation. It might not be the conversation you wanted to have, but there were Scottish voices in there. And it does feel on all sides of the house, really, and this is obviously the SNP hegemony has had that impact, that some of that's been lost, and the consequence is that Westminster can feel very, very far away and almost quite foreign at times when you're up here. And as you said, we talk about ferries, what's on the front page of our newspapers or leading our news bulletins are very different stories to what you get down there, and that perhaps is adding to the sawing away of Scotland from the UK as we go. I want to talk about Boris Johnson, just talking about character and depth and the rest of it. How does he rank amongst the Torags who've run this country over the years? How would you rate him and both strengths and weaknesses?
So first of all, the mistake, not just the left, but all his Tory colleagues make, is underestimating him. He's a particularly ruthless, tactically clever, relentless politician. I mean, there's nothing stupid about him. He doesn't do things by mistake. I mean, he does lots of personal things by mistake, and there are lots of little personal foibles which are certainly stupid. But in terms of his politics, he thinks things through very much, and he goes for it when he decided. So, I mean, if you look at the brutal brilliance of the Rwandan policy, certainly when he needed something that was going to infuriate, going to drive liberal left Britain literally insane with anger, while at the same time rallying his own core supporters, and he goes straight for it. He is not to be underestimated at any point as a politician. At a personal level, he just doesn't tell the truth. Even when he was being skewered in that brilliant interview by Susanna Reid about Elsie, 77, the pensioner who had to travel on buses because she couldn't afford to heat her house, he had to jump in and say, well, of course, I gave everybody the free bus pass. That was me. Absolutely untrue. It was the London boroughs, well before he became mayor of London, who did it. And indeed, he reduced its effectiveness by limiting the amount of time you could use for that bus pass.
And not the point he thought it was in the context of the Elsie's situation.
So it's quite hard for an interviewer a lot of the time, because you really need to almost fact check every syllable, semicolon and dash in what he says to you, which is hard work while you're trying to carry on speaking and listening at the same time.
Do you remember that? Was it before the election? I forget now because there's been so much, but that thing where he said he liked to make buses out of cardboard boxes, which was clearly not true.
Yes.
We haven't heard anything since about it. And it was such a bizarre, it was almost a surreal moment in politics, and sort of postmodern approach to media relations.
We shouldn't forget he's very funny, and he makes jokes at his own expense, and he's a great disarmer. I was talking to somebody who saw him do a kind of prime ministerial visit to a big London hospital, where he is not popular. And indeed, a lot of the nursing staff and the senior medical staff, the doctors, had lined up on a great big balcony in the main hall to boo him when he came in, booing and jeering when he came in. Now, I don't know many politicians who in those circumstances wouldn't have turned tail and left. But Johnson waves at him and says, yes, absolutely right. I know, I would be booing me too. I completely understand. I get it. I would be booing me too. Goes up. And within 20 minutes, they're eating out of his hand because he uses buffoonish. Now, lots of people simply just hate it, but we shouldn't forget the fact that it does work very effectively, which is why he carries on doing it and why he's still prime minister.
Well, perhaps the issue that, and maybe this is a more Scottish thing, although I'm sure it's true throughout the UK, is that ultimately your prime minister is someone who is a bit of a stranger to the truth, who is an utter opportunist. And who will drop people at the drop of a hat. There's no sense of really dignity or a sort of seriousness of engagement with things. And maybe it's the Presbyterian thing in Scots that, you do have a duty to the people around you and the community around you. But he does seem to wind Scottish people up particularly, but also just that sense that that's who Britain is sending out into the world to represent it as its leader. Is a difficult thing to full.
He's not a total stranger to the truth. They did once meet, and Boris asked the truth to buy him a drink, and the truth said yes, and then Boris drank the drink and vanished and was never seen again. So he's not a complete stranger. Yeah. But no, you're right. I mean, I had a sort of, as it were, epiphany moment so I buried my dad a year ago, a bit over a year ago now, in fact, and I realized when I was sitting at actually somebody else's funeral, that had happened, and we had 6 people round the grave, and his kirk was bolted and barred. He'd been an elder there for 56 years wasn't able to go in, his friends from the village weren't able to come, and so on and so on and so on. And it was the same week that one of those parties took place in Downing Street. And I find myself absolutely boiling with anger, because although, yes, as I've said, he can be funny and he's charismatic and he's a very, very good communicator. And I think it's very important for the left to keep remembering all of those things because they're true and important. At the same time, we have never had a prime minister who has imposed rules on us like he did and then broken them. And I am frankly slightly surprised there hasn't been more of a backlash in the country in the elections we've just been talking about.
No, indeed. And I suppose we'll see what comes. The other thing is you can guarantee there will be another blunder along sometime soon.
Yes.
He's not going to put Partygate behind him and then cruise smoothly to the next general election. And speaking of that, I suppose we are in tough times at the moment, but they're about to get even tougher. We're still living with the challenges of Brexit and maybe waking up to some of them as time passes. The cost of living crisis is the biggest issue in politics and will become ever more so as time passes. I hear people talking about it everywhere I go at the moment. Their heating bills especially are there. We have an international crisis with COVID. We're still dealing with the consequences, international crisis with Ukraine, and we're still dealing with the consequences of COVID and, children's lost education, mental health issues. How do you see all this playing out over the next few years in the political sphere? What do you think the priorities will be? And, the Tories have sort of pinned themselves to levelling up, which strikes me as a great slogan and actually a good idea, but I don't have great confidence in Boris Johnson having the rigour to deliver it. But how do you see?
Or the money? I mean, I think the short answer to your question, Chris, is everything gets worse. I don't see any early end to the Ukraine war. I think it's going to be a horrible grinding process, highly unpredictable, very, very dangerous. But the sort of throttling of Ukraine's grain exports and Russia's oil and gas and all the rest of it out of the world economy means world inflation and world shortages are going to get worse, not better. I think inflation at home is going to get even worse. I mean, maybe not in the medium term, but long term, we face a big inflationary problem again. I don't really see, I mean, thank God COVID is finally receding in many ways, but the unwinding of that's going to be long and painful. Yeah. I think politics remains incredibly turbulent and difficult. My sense is that the Conservatives are unlikely to win the next election under Boris or anybody else, because I think I can't see where they go in terms of big policy ideas. You said you're right, levelling up is not a stupid idea. It's a very good idea. If you look at the semi-derelict condition of so many northern English towns more than cities. Towns, I think it's fair to say, not cities, but there's been a lot of left behind England, which is boiling with resentment. At the very best, it's boiling with resentment. The danger is when it's just simply depressed and apathetic. But there is a big job for politics to do there, and so I, in many ways, I admire the agenda, and I think Michael Gove has come up with some quite good ideas. Yeah. But it requires a very, very heavy level of investment, and looking around that investment is just not there. Finally, the Ministry of Defence is saying semi-publicly they need a lot more money because of the Ukraine war. Rishi Sunak is trying to be a traditional Thatcherite and keep the lid on things. I think the only way out is some kind of rethinking of borrowing and use of sort of national bonds, a bit as in a wartime situation. Yeah. But that's the sort of left field, literally thinking that we're not going to get from this government. Yeah. And my hope is that at some point, perhaps looking at the interstices and the entrails of these polls, perhaps at some point, the Labour Party takes up these ideas.
And I suppose, as you say, it's possible, perhaps even probable, that the Conservatives don't that lose the next election. That doesn't mean that Labour win it, of course, because we might have something like a hung parliament, and at that point, perhaps the SNP come into play, and certainly the Tories will make a lot of that in the run-up to the next election, with as they had Alex Salmond in Ed Miliband's pocket, or was it vice versa? I can't remember. But they'll be using that again, and I think that use of Scotland as a bargaining chip, or even something to threaten English voters, seems to work quite well, but it doesn't play well particularly up here. You wrote about Scotland recently, and we'll come on to that, but you've been away from Scotland for a long time, and I was, I think, from about a decade, from 2005 to 2014. And I found that when I returned to Scotland in 2014, just in time for the referendum, it took me quite a while to recalibrate, because Scotland had changed a lot while I'd been away. Whenever I visited back, I couldn't really get to grips with what was happening around me. I didn't feel part of it, and I didn't really understand why it was changing the way it was. But it was, and the nationalists were on the march. They were in power at Holyrood. Culturally, you could feel things change. There was, the arts community was picking up this argument for independence, separation from England. So obviously the SNP is now the power in the land, has been for a while, shows no sign of changing anytime soon. Look back to your early years covering politics, so back to the early 80s and whatever. Would you ever have predicted something like this?
No, I think the thing that I got, I didn't fully understand, is I thought that an effective Scottish Parliament would put a brake on the full-scale nationalism. And I should come out openly now, perhaps, Chris, and say, I am, in all circumstances, English, German, French, Scottish, I'm an anti-nationalist, in the sense I don't like the politics of division, us and them. We're better than you. You people over the other side of the border are somehow less than me. I hate that politics. That doesn't mean I'm against self-government by any means at all. It's the kind of xenophobic edge that comes in so often into nationalist arguments that I absolutely loathe. But I was a member of the campaign for Scottish Assembly and marched and all the rest of it, campaigned for that. Radical Scotland I was involved in back then. And I read, I look at the Scotsman and the Herald every day. I talk to friends. I come back to Scotland quite a lot, but I have to be very, very conscious and cautious, in the sense that living down in London, I am a long, long way away from the Scottish political culture. And however many MPs of all stripes from Scotland I talk to, however much I read, is not quite the same as being there. And I am very much aware that I am not properly educated in contemporary Scotland, to put it bluntly. My bookshelves are full of sort of MacDermott and Shirley MacLaine and Ian Crockett and the rest of it, and modern authors as well. But still, and I think the biggest change for me coming back was that all my one-time Labour friends are now SNP. Almost everybody has moved across. And of course, we've seen the effects of that electorally. But no, I mean, I don't have many friends in Scotland at the moment who aren't SNP.
And I suppose, if Nicola Sturgeon, well, she might not put it this way, but I'll put it this way on her behalf, whether she'd thank me or not. The SNP, you make your points about nationalism and about borders and being different and whatever, but she would make the case, as some academics do, that there are different types of nationalism, and that what they are trying to do is a more civic form of nationalism where, they're not looking to fall out with England. They say England would be Scotland's best friend if Scotland was independent. The independence cause is heavily feminised. There's a lot of women in there. They're talking about well-being. They're talking about inclusive growth. They're trying to create, I guess, a sort of social democratic Scotland, almost in opposition to the Boris Johnson view of the world and Steve Baker view of the world. And so how does that fit in a sense, when you can see what they're trying to do and they're looking to the Nordic states and things that are actually quite appealing to certain people from a certain political viewpoint, but it comes with the price of the end of the union. And without that, you don't get what's on offer, in a sense.
I have a lot of sympathy. You could call it Borgen politics almost, couldn't you?
Yeah.
There is absolutely crucial and very, very important, I think. However, as I understand it, the realities are still the realities, which are that Scotland wants to join. That's absolutely central to the SNP's programme, that Scotland rejoins the EU. And I absolutely get the fury people must feel about having voted to stay inside the EU and being forced out by the neighbouring country. I get that completely. But if Scotland rejoins the EU, Scotland, and I think at times the SNP is heroically optimistic when they assume that the mood in London will be benign and friendly. Particularly, in my recent New Statesman piece, I wrote about the Trident issue, particularly around that and defence. I think things could get very aggressive, not ugly, not violent in any way at all, but I don't think it would be a benign pro-Scotland, let's make this work as well as we can kind of London administration, either of a Labour or of a Tory stripe.
And obviously what we don't have yet are hard and fast proposals on the issues that will actually affect the day-to-day running of the country, like a central bank, like a currency, like the border with England and how that would operate. I know that they're working quite hard on those kind of things behind the scenes. In your Ukraine piece, you talked about NATO and how war in Ukraine has kind of rekindled that sense across the British Isles of it's good to be part of NATO. It's not a bad thing to have a nuclear deterrent in that situation. And your view is, I guess, that's the kind of thing that doesn't play well for the SNP because they want Trident gone from the Clyde, and there's no obvious place for the English to put it in that scenario. But they want to be part of NATO. There's a sort of having your cake and eat it. We'll provide battlefield medicines. You protect us with your nuclear weapons, but we're not having any in our country.
Yes, I mean, Chris, I should underline again. These are sort of guesses and judgments on my part, sitting in London a long way away. But I strongly suspect that pulling out of the whole the nuclear deterrence game, if that's what it is, grim game, and being in alliance at least with a party which wants to pull out of NATO and having an anti-NATO tradition in your own party will not only play quite badly among Scottish middle ground opinion, but there's a very interesting quirk to this, which is if the Tories are looking for, as it were, a political or high-minded kind of reason to refuse a referendum next year, then they've got it with this. And so it's not just that I think it'd be hard for the SNP to win under these circumstances while the Ukraine war is going on, though I do think that. I think that this gives the Tories their reason to refuse a legal referendum. And so far as I can tell, I don't see Nicola Sturgeon having a way around that. We still haven't seen the legal advice. We're all waiting for it. But I don't see a way through that because she's been very clear, and I think rightly, that an informal, or to put it aggressively, illegal referendum gives no international legal standing for an independent Scotland and creates vast problems going forward. And so I think they are stuck at the moment. I don't take any great pleasure in that. I mean, I do really understand the need for the desire for self-government, and I do understand completely the frustration and even anger with the London political culture. I mean, we feel it in London too, I hasten to add, many of us. And that was what I was trying to outline in that piece.
You talked about whether there will be a referendum. I suppose there's another argument whether there should be a referendum, which is a different thing. And the point has been made by people outside Scotland, I've heard it from Oxford academics, that having the SNP win election after election and refusing to give them a democratic route to a referendum is quite anti-democratic. And what is the route to independence in a way if it's not through winning elections and you will not give them the chance to hold a referendum? You end up almost sort of bottling up this energy, which perhaps doesn't end well. I'm interested in your thoughts on, I agree with you. I don't think Boris is going to allow a referendum, but 2014 was won by the Union side, even if it was a little bit close for comfort and closer than many of us expected. At the start of that game, the SNP has gone from strength to strength in the aftermath. So what's your view on a second referendum and whether one should be allowed and held and the timing of that? Because otherwise, I suppose this period of dominance starts to look like it's being blocked off from having the democratic outcome it's entitled to.
You have to start from first principles here, I think, Chris, don't you? First principle, the Scottish people have a right to self-determination, period. Now, the timing of it and the way it happens is for negotiation, always. And I think, another period of perhaps more successful SNP government, a period where it's clear that the Holyrood Parliament and Holyrood government are using what tax raising powers they have to shape a different kind of economic and social agenda, much more clearly than is going on right now, then puts more pressure on London. But I think this has to be a constant negotiation. I don't see any reason why there shouldn't be a further drive to, if you like, a more federal Britain, to give the Scottish people, as it were, many of the benefits of independence. In other words, their own tax raising powers, their own economic strategy, own immigration strategy, etc., 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 but without the potential dangers or perils or pitfalls of full old-fashioned national sovereignty and a saltire outside the United Nations and all the costs and that, and the Scottish Navy, the Scottish Air Force, and all of that. So, I mean, I think what strikes me is just the lack of creative thinking about this subject in London. I think both of the main parties down here have been extraordinarily, what's the word, unimaginative, smug, head in the sand about the Scottish question for a very long period of time. And that is frustrating as well.
And of course, so, it's not just Scotland, is it? Because we have in Northern Ireland, we have Sinn Féin doing very well in the polls today. So the Northern Ireland question, and obviously following on from Brexit and the trade border there is an issue. We have, as you said earlier, the patchwork of people in England voting for very different things. We have the advent of the directly elected mayors, which is a really interesting political experiment in Greater Manchester and the West Midlands and whatever. Is there a sort of reconstructed Britain? Do you think that's the work of governments over the next maybe decade to put together a Britain that is loose enough to stay together, but has enough of an identity to want to stay together, central identity?
Well, you say very lucidly and clearly what I would like to see happen, because this version isn't working very well and won't work for much longer, I think. So, there has to be really radical thinking. You mentioned right at the beginning, very kindly, my very first book, The Battle for Scotland. And I started that with Asquith before the First World War. And I still find his notion, because of course, Ireland, all of Ireland was still part of the Union at that point, before the 1915 events, 1916. And he called for home rule all round. In other words, national parliaments with a single, as it were, home rule chamber sitting in London to negotiate those things between them that needed to be negotiated, but with the UK remaining a unitary but heavily federalized country. And I still think there's an awful lot of common sense behind that.
I'm going to ask one more question from me, and then we'll open up for the last 10 minutes to the floor. I wanted to talk to you about the media, which obviously is a big part of both our lives. And the power of the mainstream media isn't what it was at the height, certainly, of your newspaper career. And even when I started out, that's not to say they're not more widely read than ever, thanks to online dissemination of works. But we see all sorts of online outlets opening up, some of them very radical. And we have GB News now and Rupert Murdoch's Top TV. We'll see if that works or not. And we've got this thing that I've seen called the attention economy, where the more noise you make, the more controversial you are, the more popular you will be, the more talked about you will be. And perhaps someone like Piers Morgan is the most mainstream example of that. There are people obviously on the wings of things who did it in a less sort of pleasant way. But you know, you're a thoughtful and nuanced guy, and you try to understand things, and then you apply your views to them. Is there enough space for considered thought and nuance in this media climate? Do you think there's a way back from the shrieking ninnies on the edge to knit us together again?
Okay, I think the way I would approach this, Chris, is by saying you wouldn't go into a building that called itself a museum where there was just a huge uncurated assemblage of objects without any guide, without any descriptions, where there were mounds and mounds and mounds of kind of horns and dusty old swords and bits and pieces. It would just be, it would look like a rubbish dump or a second-hand shop, and it wouldn't give you the experience. What you need from a museum is you need a curator.
Story we are telling, here's why we're telling it. This object is important, it matters, here's why, and as it were, guides you through. And I think the mainstream media are simply a curated version of what would otherwise be a morass of undifferentiated information. If you look at Twitter or other social medias, what happens is individuals grab onto the facts or the unfacts or whatever appeals to them, which fit their personal viewpoint, and push them as hard out there as they can. So you've got lots and lots of push and almost no curation. And I still think there's a big role for organizations which try to order the things around them. That's what the New Statesman is, for instance. Order what's around and then tell a story about what's going on, what matters in the world, what doesn't matter in the world at the moment. Very interesting that although the mainstream media are in many ways in clear secular decline at the moment, if you look at these last local elections, there are two big stories which dominated a lot of the argument and the coverage in the course of them. One was Partygate, and one was, as it were, the response, Beergate. Now, Partygate was driven very, very strongly by traditional journalists working for the Daily Mirror, getting scoops from inside Whitehall, getting photographs, getting stories, getting details of those parties, and pushing them again and again and again. And of course, Beergate was almost entirely driven by the Daily Mail and the Sun, again using their best endeavours to and their front pages to put the squeeze on Keir Starmer in a way that was uncomfortable for him. Those stories are driven by very, very traditional media operating in a very traditional way. And actually, during these campaigns, social media has not been at the races, really. So it's, you know, none of these things are inevitable. And I spent my entire career, I guess, in the mainstream media of one kind or another, so I would be supporting them. But I still think having a small group of people who agree but not completely, talking together, arguing together, trying to make sense of the world around them is helpful to readers, viewers, listeners, or what have you.
Yeah, well, that perhaps leads us on to our first audience question quite neatly. Leslie, are you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's been very interesting. Thank you. I'm wondering, do we need a more consensual approach to some of the bigger issues like health to ever crack them? And if so, how do we get there in this populist age described as you have earlier? How do we get some of these bigger issues resolved in the country?
Well, health is an interesting one because in a sense, I suppose you'd say that there was a bigger consensus on health than anything else. There are very, very few people, except on the extreme right of the Conservative Party, who would want to see the end of the National Health Service. So there is a sort of central consensus there. There's not a consensus about the cost of medicines or the way hospitals are run or the distribution of resources between GPs and hospital doctors and all of those things. I think in health, as in so many other things, what we really lack in this country is a really good management culture. We don't talk about management much in this country. You know, the Americans, particularly in the private sector, they all go to management schools. They learn how to run things. We, by and large, assume that if you're a jobbing hack, you can run a newspaper. Well, in my case, that proved to be wrong. But, you know, there isn't really a kind of senior college for health administrators or whatever. So I think in health, what we need is to run things better and to have, I mean, I guess the arguments around health are reasonably well distributed around the papers. I noticed the Murdoch papers spend a lot of time now talking about obesity and different drug treatments and breakthroughs of one kind or another. The health problem is really about resources, which is that if we all got what we wanted from the National Health Service, there would literally not be a penny spent on anything else. So there is always going to be a rationing question. And that does get people hot under the collar, and it's very difficult as we've got an aging society. But so I think it's money more than consensual politics that's the issue there.
Yeah, and money is going to be more of an issue going forward because not only are we having to fund the things we've always funded, we have an aging population, we have more demands on things like social care, and you get to a point where the demand for higher taxes or the need to meet public demand becomes a very difficult thing to argue against. I think, and we can see that the Tories almost big statism that they're observing at the moment. Peter Peacock, Peter, you have a question? Are you with us, Peter?
Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can. So I'm not sure about your connection, Peter. Can you hear me? Doesn't.
You can hear me.
Well, I can hear you now.
Point to Andrew.
Peter, you're breaking up. We can't hear you clearly. Hang on. I'll go to. If I just stop you there, Peter, because we can't hear you properly. I'll go to Alistair Stewart.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Peter, we can't hear you. Sorry. Could you just leave it just now, and we'll try someone else because it's not working.
Okay, you still got me. I'm interested in Andrew's thoughts.
in general? Hello, you've gone as well, Alistair.
No, I'm still here. I'm still here.
Oh, right, Alistair, do you want to ask your question? Sorry.
Yeah, no, of course. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much, Andrew, for taking time today. Question for me: if successive electoral wins for the SNP are not enough to qualify for a second independence referendum, and assuming that the idea of a federal UK is dead or certainly not happening at the moment, what recourse do you think that ordinary voters have to get a referendum, to express that enthusiasm for one and Scottish independence? Because it seems at the moment public vitriol very much seems at breaking point, I suppose, particularly online.
I think civil protest. I mean, marches, demonstrations, industrial action. The use of all of those tools will come next if nothing else changes. As long as they're done peacefully and with dignity and respect for the law. After a while, mass public disaffection, mass public demands for something like that become harder and harder to resist. So it's a boring argument, if you like, big marches and petitions and all the rest of it. But that is the next, if the politicians aren't stepping to one side and saying, yes, okay, in that case, go ahead. I think, frankly, over time, if Scotland really wants another referendum, then London can be embarrassed into giving them one.
And one thing I'd quite like to ask Andrew just before we wrap up is the Simon Cooper book Chums, which is about the old Etonian and Oxbridge crew, which somehow in 2022 still dominates British politics. And again, in Scotland, it's not, I suppose the class thing, the upper classes ruling politics is not what we have. Our politicians at Holyrood tend to come from within the communities they represent. And that sense of the torch being passed from, David Cameron to Boris Johnson and them all getting their friends around them, etc. Will British politics ever free itself of that born to rule, trained to rule group of people at the top? Are we going to move to a point where it does feel properly meritocratic?
Well, I am an optimistic bunny by and large, and so my answer will be yes. And then you say, well, how and why? I would have thought if the Conservatives are defeated at the next election, and we have a period of Labour rule. Labour used to be dominated by people who came from private schools and all the rest. Not that long ago, you listen to the Labour of the age of Roy Jenkins and Harold Wilson and so forth, and they sounded remarkably posh. But modern Labour is not like that. You've got the likes of Lisa Nandy and Angela Rayner, and actually virtually the entire front bench come from middle class, or I don't know whether these categories matter anymore, but sort of working class backgrounds. A period where those people are running the country for a while makes the Labour Party, the Tory party, in turn, I think, hold on, have we got this right? And if you look at some of the rising stars in the Tory party, particularly in the north of England, the Midlands, it's very important that they won those seats, because in people like Ben Houchen, the mayor up in the Tees Valley and others, you see people who come from a much more, as it were, normal middle class, lower middle class community background. The Tory party, apart from the very top, is beginning to sound a bit different. Not necessarily different politically, not necessarily particularly friendly, but it's sounding different. And I think this particular group of old, it's become so much of a cliche. You look at sort of TV shows like Anatomy of a Scandal, and it is the kind of ruling cliche now. And once somebody realizes they're living in a cliche, they tend to exit stage left.
Yeah. Just one little question come in, if you've just got a second. But Peter Dees asked, what can journalists do when asking the hard questions? Politicians avoid it and clearly just stay on message. Is there hope of proper scrutiny? We did see there was a thing on Twitter earlier this week about I think it was Harold Wilson being interviewed, and it was brilliant. And his response to a very intelligent question was a very intelligent and quite free-flowing answer, not what we've been used to, and we've been watching you try to winkle the truth out of people, and sometimes you've had to come at things quite laterally and surprise them with a question to try and get them to maybe step away from the received line. What's your sort of thinking on that now?
Well, I've tried all sorts of techniques which haven't worked. I mean, with somebody like Boris Johnson, who's just determined to say whatever he was going to say, no matter what you can ask, you have a choice of either being increasingly obstreperous in trying to shut him up. accused him of chuntering and so forth. And that very often ends up in a kind of undignified shouting match, which does nobody any good and which the watching audience don't enjoy at all. Or else you could just literally lie flat down on the studio floor and let him roll over you like some kind of Basque First World War tank. And that's not very dignified either. So my current belief is that when somebody is simply not answering the question, is to be calm and pause and say, I asked you this. It was a very clear question, and you have refused to answer it. Let me ask you it one more time and see if you can answer this. In other words, if you always explain again to the viewer, this is what I'm trying to ask, this is why it's not a silly question, this is why it matters, it's a serious question. And then if the politician doesn't answer or just obviously avoids the question, they do themselves, I think, quite a lot of damage. People talk about, politics is going down in the public esteem. Well, that is one of the big reasons why. If politicians won't answer straightforward questions as honestly as they can, then people watching at home draw their own conclusions, and they're not very positive ones.
Or you can go down the Paxman route of just asking, are you going to resign? So like 25 times.
Yes, but he has said himself that the reason he asked it 19 times was that he had forgotten the next question, or indeed run out of questions. And nobody was helping him in his ear, so he had no alternative. So it was more of a kind of defensive mechanism by him than the aggressive one that it looked like.
How iconic moments are made. Mistakes. Cock up, not conspiracy. Well, listen, Andrew, we're out of time, and that was just fabulous. And it was wonderful to hear your thoughts on the situation we're living in and some speculation about the situation we might be living in. As I said earlier, it's personally a great delight to have you writing again and finding your own voice. And I do urge everyone to read Andrew's pieces on the New Statesman. They are quite wonderful.
Please do. And Chris, thank you very much. I'm just looking forward one day to doing this for real live up there. I hope to get up there and meet everybody and get engaged myself.
Hopefully not too far off now.
Not too far off, I hope.
Like that. I'll be very good to see you. Okay, well, thank you again.
Take care, everybody.
To the audience. All the best.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Bye.